For today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how to solve quadratics by square rooting. So when you're solving by square rooting, you want to first start off by getting what is being squared by itself. And then once you've done that, then you'll want to take the square root of both sides. When you do this, don't forget the plus or minus that ends up happening to show up on the right-hand side. And then at the very end, get the variable, usually x, by itself. Alright, let's take a look at some examples together. So in this first one, we have x squared plus 3 equals 28. Now remember, our first step is to get what is being squared by itself. In this case, x is being squared. We want to get that by itself. So the first thing we want to do is we want to subtract 3 from both sides. After we subtract 3 from both sides, we're left with x squared equals 25. Now the next step is to take the square root of both sides, not forgetting the plus or minus. So we take the square root of the left-hand side. The square root of x squared is equal to x. And then the square root of 25 is equal to 5. Now don't forget the plus or minus 5. Now the reason why it's plus or minus 5 is because at this step here, x could be equal to positive 5. 5 squared will give you 25. Or it could be equal to negative 5, because negative 5 times negative 5 is also positive 25. So x could equal positive or negative 5. And those are our two answers for this problem. Alright, let's take a look at another example. 5x squared equals 20. Again, the first thing we want to do is we want to get what's being squared by itself. Notice here it's only the x that's being squared. The 5 is not being squared. So we want to get that 5 out of the way so that we have x squared by itself. We'll go ahead and divide both sides by 5. And that will leave us with x squared equals 4. Then we can take the square root of both sides, and that will leave us with x equals plus or minus 2, right? Because 2 times 2 is 4, and negative 2 times negative 2 will also be equal to 4. So x is equal to plus or minus 2. Alright, let's take a look at the next one. Now we have more things going on in this equation. We have 6x squared plus 54 equals 78. Again, identify what's being squared here. It's only the x that's being squared, so we need to get that by itself. Now it might take a couple more steps to get there, but we can still do the same process. So we'll go ahead and subtract 54 from both sides. That leaves me with 6x squared equals 24. And now to get x squared completely by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by 6. That's going to leave me with x squared on the left and 4 on the right. Now that we have x squared by itself, I can take the square root of both sides, and we end up with x equals plus or minus 2. Alright, example 4. 3x squared minus 11 equals 10. Again, look at what's being squared, in this case just the x, and let's get that by itself. So let's add 11 to both sides. That leaves me with 3x squared equals 21. We'll divide both sides by 3. We have x squared equals 7. Now even though 7 itself is not a perfect square, we can still take the square root of both sides. We'll just leave it in radical form. So taking the square root of both sides, we end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 7. You want to double check and make sure that the radical is in simplest form. In this case, 7 does not have any factors that are perfect squares, so we can just leave it as the square root of 7. So x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. Alright, example 5. Now, notice in this one, it's not just the x that's being squared, it's everything inside the parentheses being squared. So we want to keep that x plus 8 by itself before we take the square root of both sides. So to do that, we're going to add the 19 to both sides, and then divide both sides by 2. So let's go ahead and do that first. So add 19 to both sides. That leaves me with 2 times x plus 8 squared equals 50. And now we can divide both sides by 2. That leaves me with x plus 8 squared equals 25. Alright, now at this point, everything that's on the left is what's being squared, right? The entire thing, x plus 8, is being squared. So what I can do now is I can take the square root of both sides, and that will leave me with x plus 8 on the left and plus or minus 5 on the right. So let's go ahead and write that down. So x plus 8 equals plus or minus 5. Now we still haven't actually solved for x yet. X is still not by itself. So what we need to do is we need to actually write two separate equations, one where x plus 8 is equal to positive 5, and one where x plus 8 is equal to negative 5, because there were two possibilities. Then we'll solve each of those equations, getting x by itself by subtracting 8 from both sides. So we'll end up with x is equal to negative 3 from this first equation. And in the second equation, after subtracting 8 from both sides, we end up with x equals negative 13. So those are my two answers. X equals negative 3 and x is equal to negative 13. Alright, we're going to do one more example. So again, in this example, notice how it's not the x that's the only thing being squared. It's the entire thing in parentheses, the 4x minus 6, that's all being squared. So we're going to get that 4x minus 6 squared by itself before we take the square root of both sides. So we'll start off by adding 21 to both sides. So that's going to leave me with 3 times 4x minus 6 squared equals 12. Alright, from here, I can divide both sides by 3. And that's going to leave me with 4x minus 6, in parentheses, squared equals 4. Okay, now that we have the part that's being squared by itself, now I can take the square root of both sides. So taking the square root of both sides, that's going to leave me with 4x minus 6 equals plus or minus 2. Again, we haven't solved for x just yet. At this point, we need to write two separate equations because 4x minus 6 could equal positive 2 or it could equal negative 2. So we'll write those two equations separately. So we have 4x minus 6 equals 2 and 4x minus 6 equals negative 2. Now we can solve each of those equations. So we'll add 6 to both sides, divide both sides by 4. We get x is equal to 2. Do the same thing with the second equation, add 6 to both sides, and divide both sides by 4, and we should get x is equal to 1. So x equals 2 and x equals 1 are my two answers for this problem.